Welcome to the sixth session of the Carnegie Masterclass this year at the Wallace, and today we're going to be looking at paintings. So here we are in the Rembrandt room, one of the rooms that contains most of our Rembrandts. There were 12 Rembrandts originally, and when our dear colleague John Ingerbels wrote this little catalogue, there's only one left. So Lelia and I are going to basically take you through most of those 12 Rembrandts and explain to you why they were doubted, why some of them have made a major comeback.
It's important to kind of understand the many debates around, and I'm sure many of you do already know them, about Rembrandt, who of course had a very large workshop in Amsterdam. He's born in Leiden and trains in Leiden with a local artist. And then in the late 20s, he goes to Amsterdam, trains with Peter Lassmann, comes back to Leiden, stays there for a few more years, and in the early 1630s goes to Amsterdam. And it's there in Amsterdam that he has this big workshop with many different artists. And of course, the reason for having such a workshop is so that you train artists to work in your manner. They're basically copying the way in which you're painting, and in that time, it was completely acceptable for a pupil, a follower, to work exactly the manner of the master. And that's exactly what happened. And then, of course, with connoisseurship sort of developing in the late 19th, early 20th century, in particular with the Rembrandt Research Project, which was put together in the late 1960s, which was a group of experts, Dutch experts in particular, who were very keen to basically disentangle all of these different hands and decide who did what, which in a way goes very much against what the workshop was meant to do, which was to produce a product that was exactly the same. So this Rembrandt Research Project, they went around all the different collections, including ours, private and public, and they tried to figure out what's by Rembrandt, what's not by Rembrandt, and if it's not by Rembrandt, who is it by, which pupil, and why. As you can imagine, this is an incredibly complicated task. It's incredibly difficult, and so they've gone in, pictures have gone back and forth from attribution, from being by Rembrandt to being not by Rembrandt, and this has happened to our own pictures. By 1992, and they left us with just one picture, which is Rembrandt's portrait of Titus from 1657, which has actually never been doubted, and which is really a true masterpiece. And you know, it's beautifully painted. He doesn't really paint him as he would have looked. He's about 16, 17, of course. He's wearing a 16th century costume, this wonderful gold chain, this magnificent red beret, which I have, you know, I know he had props in his studio and he just kind of put hats on, helmets, armor on his sitters. And then, you know, very, in a way, monochromatic, using very limited color palette. The beautiful red of the beret picks up in the curls of the hair, in the lips, and then, you know, just dark background and just sort of pops out. He's really wonderful. And then, of course, beautifully lit. He's a master of chiaroscuro. This is now later Rembrandt, of course, and he does this from the very beginning. But he's very interested in how light falls and how he can really model his figures with light and shadow. And in this case, of course, the light enters from the left. And you can see how beautifully it hits the right side of his face. And then this lovely, just with a quick brush stroke, you know, you can see how he quickly sort of accented the light on the right shoulder. The painting, although never questioned, has been sort of changed over time, and this is something we'll talk about today with several pictures. It was a bit larger originally on the right-hand side and lower down, and we have a clue because we see the beginning of the signature. If you come up close, you see the R, but just the R, and we can assume that the signature would have continued.
You know, 100 years ago there were not so many techniques like there are now. So now the science, you have the X-ray, you have the underdrawing, you have the UV, you have the pigments. So there's so many things that you can take into account that when, you know, the research Rembrandt group were starting was not there.
Connoisseurship, and you know, Jorge was talking about science and great conservators such as Rupert and X-rays, but in the end, it's what the eye tells you. And you know, of course, we all have different eyes. Charles has a completely different eye to me, and we just always disagree. But you know, it's about how you look and how you get to know an artist. And I think it's really important that you do go to if you're a Rembrandt specialist, you see every single Rembrandt as possible, because then you have a good sort of visual memory, which will work well. And this picture is a real conundrum. And although it was demoted, I mean, the lady would tell us how it was, you know, believed to be one of the greatest Rembrandts when it came up at the Stowe sale in the 1840s, was it?
Yep.
It sold for about £2,300, which is a massive amount at the time.
The X-ray of this painting.
There are some changes.
Not many, any changes.
To understand, when we get the X-ray, we can see the change of compositions. That means that when somebody is creating a composition, it might have some changes, so that means that it's an original composition. When you have an X-ray with very little changes, that means that, you know, most probably that's a copy. Somebody who's looking into another painting and they're just redoing a version. So, you know, as many corrections you have, you know, it sounds like it's better, no?
Exactly. The more he moves things around, we think that's the original artist sort of trying to work out the composition directly on the canvas or the panel. I mean, this was one of the most debated paintings of the Rembrandt. This is one of the most debated paintings of the Rembrandt school. It's been attributed to someone from the studio, Simon de Vlieger, Willem Drost, Bernd Fabricius, Rembrandt and studio, Rembrandt imitator, and Rembrandt's cousin, Karel van der...
The Dutch football team.
Karel van der Ploem, who was a cousin, who possibly
Centre forward.
studied with Rembrandt. I mean, this is it. Everybody and anybody has been, because we just don't know, and it's puzzling. Or it could be Rembrandt himself, as Xavier is convinced.
I mean, for me, the really great moment here is this figure in the middle, and of course he's the protagonist. I love that arm that comes out and hits the light. I also like the way that the white around his inner shirt has been painted, and I find the expression quite psychologically engaged. The next section of our morning is looking at Canaletto. The Wallis has embarked on the major Canaletto Guardi project. We've got some of the greatest view paintings here, and the idea is to restore all of them. They were all covered with really grimy, old, yellowed varnishes, and this one and the other one has just been conserved by Rupert and his team at the Hamilton Carr Institute. Thanks to the Bank of America, they gave us £90,000 to do it, and it's been a fantastic eye-opener for all of us. And in a minute, we're going to go into the so-called vedute room, the room of views, because that's where we also have other great Canalettos, great Guardis, but also some tricky attributions, paintings that were done by followers of Canaletto, and which Charles, as a Canaletto expert, has been very keen to work on. But before we do that, I really wanted to hear from Charles why this is a great masterpiece by Canaletto.
At this moment in Canaletto's development, the light is becoming particularly icy, and he's becoming particularly precise, which is obviously the quality that people particularly appreciate in Canaletto's work today. So there's a wealth of detail, and an impression, at least, on the other hand, of topographical accuracy. I mean, you get the idea that the attention paid to detail means that this must be exactly how it looked at the time. Canaletto, in fact, had very little respect for topographical accuracy at all. And if you went round carefully checking all the buildings, I think you'd find he probably left several out in one place and added a few more somewhere else.
Would he make a sketch, or he would be painting, would this canvas be in this spot in San Giorgio, or he would make some sketches and then go back to the studio?
Yeah, it'd be entirely in the studio, and done from general compositional sketches and then from detailed sketches of buildings. And there are sketchbooks that survive, which show him sort of going up the Grand Canal and recording the appearance of all the buildings. The other point is that while Canaletto exerts the highest degree of quality control over the product that leaves his studio, at least when he wants to. It is highly unlikely that this painting is entirely by Canaletto's hand, so to speak. I mean, no one would question that it's acceptable as a fully autographed work, but I mean, who knows how many people actually contributed to it.
And it's very difficult to see a difference. You can make case for, the background buildings might be just slightly less, but it's really
I don't think you can see anything.
It was very not obvious to any of us, and we had them in the studio for 6 months or so, that there was a change anywhere, and that this is where the assistant came in. Just going quickly back to what we were saying about buildings and being topographically accurate, this one has pentimenti in it, and under infrared you can see, and I'll hand this round, that he made the dome of the church and those two towers smaller and slightly offset, and he then changed it. So he's obviously not trying to be topographically accurate if he got as far as painting. This is an infrared image that shows you beneath the surface. So so he obviously decided halfway through painting to make them a little bit bigger and a little bit more prominent for the sake of the composition rather than for any sense that they were incorrect the first time round. But having said that, often in the other version, in fact, we don't find any changes at all. And that in Canaletto is not a proof that it's not Canaletto. I know in Rembrandt it's, the more pentimenti the better in X-ray, but with Canaletto not. And sometimes you'll find a completely autographed work, and some other artists you don't expect to find pentimenti necessarily. The planning process was such that they didn't change things on the canvas. And so in this instance, it was quite nice to find these little changes and a couple of other very small changes. He'd just been sort of tinkering with the composition to get it exactly the way he wanted. But going back to the cleaning, both of them are in superb condition as to the quality of the paint, because one of the problems with oil paintings which are essentially durable in themselves. Oil is a strong material, canvas can last, wood will last, copper will last. It's old restorers are often the problem, unfortunately, and the cleaning methods of the past were sometimes more potent, less controlled. They didn't have a range of techniques we can use to remove varnish. Varnish has different solubilities from paint, but you can use something that might damage the paint when you take varnish off, and this is obviously to be avoided. But in the past, there's numerous instances where injudicious cleaning or the use of alkali or abrasives or whatever, or even misunderstanding has meant that original paint's been lost during a cleaning treatment. And in this case, we were very pleased to find that both of the paintings are superbly preserved. There is a little bit of abrasion in the sky of this painting, which may mean that someone used something a little too strong to clean it back in the 19th or even the 18th century. We don't know. The one thing we did note, and it was reasonably obvious to start with, but it became even more obvious, is that there's an extremely large old tear. So if I hand that round, there's a couple of others actually, I think.
You can actually see it with the naked eye.
You can. And with the best will in the world, you can never completely disguise. And certainly before cleaning, it was more obvious because the repaint that was put on was slightly mismatched. It had changed colour over time. So the 1947 retouching, coupled with a bit more retouching by someone else later on, had sort of expanded the amount of the damage, and they'd spread across the original. So we found that we could remove that repaint. We got down to, as you see if you look at that photograph, that's actually a fill, that white line. It's a very big tear. We don't know when it happened, there's no record. We think it happened very early on because the painting at the moment has a double layer of canvas. It's had a lining canvas put on, possibly in the 19th century, probably in the 19th century. We would expect a tear like that to have occurred in an unlined painting, which is just the simple canvas as it was painted, which is obviously much more fragile. Certainly with a bit of time, it becomes very brittle. It's a very unusual tear because it's got a curve.
It's an L-shaped tear.
It's L, but it's got a curve. It almost looks like it's a knife cut, actually.
What we thought we'd do in here is really give you the tools of connoisseurship that you would need to decide what is the Canaletto and what isn't. So Charles and Rupert have each volunteered very kindly to talk about a picture to really help with showing you what they look at when they think about what is the Canaletto and what isn't, in terms of the artist himself and his style and in terms of the condition of a painting.
Ground colour is one thing that we look at when we're looking at periods and things, because although you'd think, well, the ground is hidden, but it's not always hidden, you get the impression of the colour of the ground often being used by the artist, or it may come through because of later abrasion. And red grounds on this period of Canaletto, sometimes with a grey overpaint or imprimatura, is what you'd expect. But a pure grey ground, and if you analyse it, you can actually see what the pigments are, is typical of England. And so copies made in England after they'd been delivered to England are more likely to have that ground. And it would be very strange if a Venetian copy had a pure grey ground. So this one has a grey ground.
Is it possible?
The ground is where
the lower layer of paint,
layer
which covers the whole canvas. It's just a plain colour. I mean, white grounds, grey grounds, red grounds. Whatever.
That's not English.
Well, this needs to be resolved because it's definitely got a grey ground.
That's not English.
Yeah. So we have an interesting conundrum there. Now this is actually a very good point because sometimes technical information may conflict with connoisseurial, and you've got to be very careful because technical information is based on the statistics. We've looked at a lot of these things, but it's not written and hard and fast. No one in Venice shall ever use a grey ground. That's not written down anywhere. And people may have not followed it, or you may have got an artist coming from another place to work in Venice who used their own. So we've got to be very careful about giving primacy to technical information. It's always contributory to the connoisseurship to the art historical, the provenance, etc. And you know, sometimes if you just look at all the technical information, you might say this is a painting by so-and-so, but you look at the painting, it's not good enough. You then have to think, well, hold on, you know.
And you also have to take into account that, yes, maybe this canvas was prepared in England, but brought back to Venice and painted on by a Venetian
possibilities.
artist.
And you have to bring all this evidence together when you're looking at a painting, trying to attribute it, rather than just relying on one or two sort of, you know, yes, the X-ray may show some changes, maybe it doesn't, but that on its own isn't going to be enough. So within the infrared, we want to look at that. We want to look at the layer structure of the painting. We want to look at the canvas weave. You know, is the canvas weave consistent for that period, for example? There are analyses done from some artists where you can actually work out, it's been done with Van Gogh and many other people, which bits of the canvas roll the canvas came from. You can actually trace the weave. No one's yet done that for Canaletto, but it might be another way of sort of deducing things that were at least within his studio, because you buy a roll of canvas and then cut it up, as opposed to things that look superficially similar but were created somewhere else. Ground structure, as I say, you know, the different layering is very critical. So all of those things, I'm not going to sort of be able to necessarily point to any one of these and say categorically, especially the ones we haven't yet examined, because we're still, as you can see, I think the yellow varnish is really obvious on this one here.
Yeah. I mean,
it's very patchy.
You can really see the difference that
Yeah.
cleaning makes. If you look at these, for example,
Yeah.
and you look at that one, and this one, although dirty, you can see some incisions. and
Exactly,
things,
yes.
which
That's
is
a
quite
good sign.
interesting. So we
You'd have to come very, very close, and they almost, until you've got the raking light, you can't tell if they're actually sometimes painted in. But those are structure lines creating the little roundels, and you often get them incised into the side of the Doge's palace. You get the diagonals. Those are frequently incised.